Hello and welcome, history fans, to History Play-by-Play. Today we look at how Columbus Day was created and its complicated legacy.
In all alone. Dangle, shot. He scores!
So in the last three videos we've talked about Christopher Columbus, why everything you know about him is wrong, why he was a terrible person, and so on. So the obvious question, why is there Columbus Day? What are we celebrating? Why is that there still? Why was it ever created? Well, there is a history to that, like there is to everything. First and foremost, Columbus wasn't initially celebrated by the American colonists. They all looked to the English explorer John Cabot. Well, he really was an Italian explorer named Giovanni Caboto, sailing for England. But he's the one who discovered most of what we think of as the United States, what we think of as America, whereas Columbus was in the Caribbean. So the American colonists and early Americans really didn't think much of Christopher Columbus. They looked at John Cabot as the person who discovered America. But then some things happened in 1770s that basically the American colonies didn't like England anymore, so they didn't want to celebrate an Englishman. Well, again, Italian, but you know what I mean. So they started looking for non-English options, and what they settled on was Christopher Columbus. Oh, he was here in the continents before John Cabot was, and therefore they started working on Columbus. And that just kind of became a footnote for a very long time. No one really cared about who came to this land first from Europe or why this trade and the Columbian Exchange started. That really wasn't a thing people worried about or discussed. It was a back burner issue. So let's fast forward to when it does become relevant, and that is post-Civil War in the Second Industrial Revolution, or the Industrial Revolution when it comes to the United States, really. When things ramp up, we get new immigration coming in from Europe. Southern Europe and Eastern Europe would be moving in. This is when a lot of my family, a lot of people out there watching this, their families came to the United States. And like all times in history, the new immigrants in the United States were hated and vilified, and xenophobia was rampant. You can see the stuff that's going on from any time in American history. What we think, how immigrants are treated has not changed. I mean, the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798 made it especially difficult for French immigrants because the French Revolution was going on and we wanted to hate them at the time. And the rhetoric looks much the same today. For a nation of immigrants, we are really bad at accepting immigrants. It's frustrating. Italians were one of the most targeted groups at this time, and so that's where the focus is. And like I said, this rhetoric, you could put this at any time in American history, and you basically get the same ideas. That they're bringing terrible ideas, they're bringing their crime, and so on. And again, like I said, Italians were particularly targeted this time. They were considered to be boorish and lower cultured and incapable of thinking on par with good white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. It's bad. It was bad. Let's leave it at bad. So the first instances of any recognition of Columbus happened at really the 400th anniversary in 1892, following a lynching of an Italian immigrant and then the murder of 11 Italian immigrants in the city of New Orleans. Benjamin Harrison notes the calendar and says that, yes, let's have a celebration of Christopher Columbus as a response to the outrage of the Italian community and actually Italy. There were actually international responses to how poorly Italians were being treated at this time. Italian immigrants and Italian Americans were celebrating Columbus Day in New York City as early as 1866. This particular photo is from when Benjamin Harrison made that proclamation. So that was when it really gets a big thing and some recognition nationwide. But it didn't carry on. It more or less fizzed out at that point. Recognized in New York, where you have a large Italian population, and very few other places. It was Angelo Noce who really made Columbus Day. He, in Italian, a first-generation Italian immigrant, lived in Denver, Colorado, and he campaigned for his state of Colorado to have a day to recognize Columbus annually. And he wanted it so that the Italian immigrants and the sons and daughters of Italian immigrants would have someone to look up to from their culture. They wanted an American hero that was of their ethnicity. They wanted to see this example out in culture. And if you read the letters from Noce, that's really the big thing. He pumps up Columbus as someone who is extremely important to American history for why any of us are here, and that using math and navigation and all the things that involve that should be celebrated and give Italian Americans a good example to follow, someone to celebrate, a reason to be proud of being Italian. So with his campaigning, it's declared a state holiday in 1905. It's made a permanent thing in 1907. And that's really where Columbus Day happens. And that's just for the state of Colorado. In Colorado, it became a state holiday. Shortly after this, it would catch on in Latin America. And there are Columbus Day celebrations throughout Latin America to this day. But that wasn't an official national holiday. Beginning in the 1920s, that the Knights of Columbus, can't imagine why they'd want to have a Columbus Day, petitioned Franklin Roosevelt for the same reasons that Noce had to recognize Columbus Day. He made official proclamations, unofficial observation. This is not a day off. This is just put out some American flags and bunting and go, yay, Columbus. Maybe talk about it a little bit, but little more than that. 1937, we get the first federal Columbus Day. It would actually be a lot longer till it becomes what it is today. Mariana Lucha, I might be mispronouncing that, of Buffalo, New York, created a committee that lobbied for Columbus Day to be made a federal holiday, much like the 4th of July or the many other days that are mandated that we have off, at least for government institutions. And so it succeeded. It did 2 years of lobbying. 1968, it becomes a federal holiday. It was on October 11th, which October 12th is generally considered when Columbus landed in Hispaniola. It would be moved 3 years later in 1971 to be the second Monday in October, where it has been ever since. And with Noce and then the Knights of Columbus and finally Luca, who is not usually talked about in all of this. Usually the conversations end with FDR making a federal holiday. It evolved. That's where we get Columbus Day. It was meant to be a good thing for Italian immigrants, children of Italian immigrants, to have someone to look up to. It had a purpose, but it had obvious problems. I mean, discovery is a problematic word. That implies that they didn't know they were there. I mean, there were literally millions of American Indians, of indigenous people here in North and South America whenever Columbus made it to the Caribbean. To discover people, I mean, what does that really mean? What does that imply? There's a lot of baggage in that word. Noce, if you read his letters, he says that Columbus brought civilization to the New World. Oh my goodness, that is a loaded term. And that's not the only time. He says it in many different ways, in many different descriptions, but the entire concept of bringing civilization is thoroughly problematic because that implies that the people already here did not have civilization. They were uncivilized. And that's where you get major issues with the whole thing. And that's before you even get to what Columbus actually did. Okay, he was the first European to come here that we have written records of, started the influx of Europeans, but what happened with that? The downfall of so many Native American civilizations at the hands of those Europeans, the millions and millions of deaths that are directly and indirectly attributable to Christopher Columbus. That all of this is not something that a great many people, the people who were here first, really want to celebrate. How dare you celebrate the person who led to the murder of all of their ancestors? Like, that is a thoroughly loaded statement to come up with to celebrate this guy. There's a lot there. And so the protest back against it is Indigenous Peoples Day. And it takes on some different names, but this is generally what it is. The first time we really see a pushback is in 1977. A group of American Indians, or groups of American Indians, there were multiple protest groups, protested in Boston in 1977 for protesting against Thanksgiving. And as that rolled on and trying to get more and more talk going on in it, the 500th anniversary of Columbus's voyage in 1992 is where we really see the actual movement against Columbus Day coalesce. When everyone's reaching out to celebrate for a 500th anniversary, they're like, the movement to, no, you should not celebrate this guy. That's where it really happens. And there's major pushes to change the story of Columbus in schools, and that's really where we see the biggest impact We'll get back to that. The city of Berkeley, California was the first to actually have an Indigenous Peoples Day. Since then, we've seen significant growth. 13 states do not celebrate Columbus Day. While you get the day off, it's not called Columbus Day. You can see the states listed there. Indigenous Peoples Day is what 12 of those states have. South Dakota celebrates Native Americans Day, and that actually was the first one way back in 1989, the first of these days celebrating any indigenous peoples as legislature. But the thing is you need to, if you start changing the rhetoric. There's a lot, if you look at the American Indian movement and similar groups and the letters that are open letters to the editor that are published in newspapers, they say that there's a lot of victory in just having the conversation of what really happened with Columbus, of why we shouldn't celebrate. That any change, and even debate, is a victory in and of itself. When you look at some of the older stuff about Columbus, you look at cartoons and educational stuff from the 50s and 60s, it's downright appalling how the Native Americans are left out of this story or are at the bottom of this story, and Columbus is an outright hero. So to see that rise and fall just in the span of a century is pretty impressive. Because the whole thing is a very complicated legacy. There are so many places named for Columbus. He is known in all these textbooks and taught. And as a teacher, I get at the high school level, I always ask, why do we teach it this way? Why are you taught the lies? And it generally comes down to, when do you learn about Columbus? Kindergarten, first grade, second grade at the latest? How do you teach a first grader about genocide? How do you have those conversations? And while some people are able to, I take my hat off. It's so impressive to see things that talk about the Holocaust, but geared for elementary students. I don't know how I would explain this stuff to an elementary student without scarring them for life, so I defer to those who can. And really, that's where the story needs to change. It needs to change at the elementary level, where we can find ways to better explain this story so that we don't teach the lie that you all got, and then we can get to the truth that much quicker before you get to high school, when you're still forming these opinions and gaining interest in this stuff. That having that conversation of how should we teach this at a young age, before you're able to handle a concept like mass murder and enslavement and so on. That's well beyond my pay grade, I'll tell you that. And I defer to anyone who knows how to make that happen. My hat's off to you. But that's really where the changes need to happen. We teach Columbus in this nice, lovely manner. We teach him as a hero still, and not often enough do we crash that all down later when you can handle it better, when you can understand it better, when you can see the nuances to it. And for the most part, by then, it's usually too late. So what started as something to help immigrants now is something that hurts natives, indigenous peoples. It's a very complicated history, but it did have good intentions when it started, and it did have a purpose. But is that purpose outdated, and should we change it? That's the debate I leave up to you. And with that, finally, that's all I have for you. That's the end of the episode. What you just saw is this teacher's interpretation of events. If you use this for a class, let me know how that went in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you can figure out how today's jersey matches the content, let me know in the comments. That's extra credit. I'm John Baranowski, and thanks for watching.